Sometimes, you're sitting at the kitchen table after everyone else has gone to bed, and you're not praying, not crying, not even thinking clearly. You're just sitting there. And in that stillness, something stirs in you that you can't quite name. It's not fear, not exactly, though it might feel like fear's quieter cousin. It's the weight of something you've been carrying for so long that you've forgotten what it feels like to set it down. Maybe it's your marriage. Maybe it's the way things have felt lately. Not broken, but stuck. Not failing, but not quite flourishing the way you thought it would. And if that's where you are tonight, I want you to stay here with me for a while. Not because I have all the answers, but because I've learned something about the way God works in marriages, and I think it might speak to where you are. There's a kind of movement that happens in relationships when God decides to press something forward. And it's not always the movement we expect. It doesn't always look like sudden reconciliation, or overnight transformation, or some dramatic moment where everything falls into place. Sometimes God pressing something forward looks like two people learning to breathe in the same room again. Sometimes it looks like patience becoming a habit instead of a chore. Sometimes it looks like silence that used to feel cold, becoming silence that feels safe. And here's the thing that so many people miss. The reason God presses a marriage forward is almost never just about the marriage itself. It's about something bigger. Something you can't see from where you're standing right now. When God looks at your marriage, He doesn't just see two people trying to figure out how to love each other better. He sees a story that reaches forward and backward in ways you can't imagine. He sees children who aren't born yet, learning what love looks like by watching you two work through hard seasons. He sees friends and family members quietly paying attention to how you handle struggle, how you extend grace, how you stay when it would be easier to leave. He sees generations that will inherit either patterns of faithfulness or patterns of brokenness, depending on what you choose to build now. This is not pressure. This is perspective. Because sometimes, the reason you feel so compelled to keep going, even when you're tired, even when you're not sure you have it in you, that's not just willpower. That's something deeper. That's God pressing forward because He knows what's at stake. In the book of Ecclesiastes, there's a verse that says two are better than one, because if one falls down, the other can help lift them up. But it also says something that I think gets overlooked. It says a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. And that third strand, that's not just a poetic addition. That's the presence of God woven into the very fabric of a covenant relationship. When God is the third strand in your marriage, you have access to a kind of strength that doesn't make sense on paper. You have endurance that shouldn't be possible given everything you've been through. You have hope that refuses to die, even when circumstances seem hopeless. And that's not because you're better than anyone else. It's because God has bound Himself to your story in a way that He refuses to undo. I've talked to so many people over the years who felt like their marriage was barely hanging on by a thread. And what I've noticed again and again is that the thread they think is so fragile is often God Himself, the one strand that cannot be broken. You might feel weak, your spouse might feel distant, the ground beneath you might feel unsteady. But if God is woven into your marriage, then the thread holding you together is not your emotions, not your effort, not even your love. It's His faithfulness, and His faithfulness is not dependent on your performance. That should give you permission to breathe, because so many of us approach marriage like we're the ones holding the whole thing together. We carry it on our shoulders like it will fall apart the moment we stop striving. But here's the truth. God is doing work in your marriage that you are not responsible for producing. He is softening hearts you cannot reach. He is planting seeds you did not even know were needed. He is creating space for conversations that haven't happened yet, healing that hasn't surfaced yet, breakthroughs that are still forming beneath the surface. And all He asks of you is to stay faithful in the small things. That's it. Not perfection, not heroic sacrifice. Just faithfulness in the small things. A kind word when you could have stayed silent. A moment of patience when you could have reacted. A prayer whispered in the morning before anyone else wakes up. A decision to believe the best about your spouse, even when doubt tries to tell you otherwise. These are the building blocks God uses. This is the raw material He takes and multiplies. There's a story in the Bible about a man named Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his own brothers. He spent years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He was forgotten, overlooked, and left in the dark for what must have felt like an eternity. But at the end of his story, when he finally stood before the very brothers who had betrayed him, he said something remarkable. He said, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." And that good wasn't just personal, it was generational. It saved an entire nation. It preserved a family line that would eventually produce kings and prophets and ultimately the Messiah himself. Joseph couldn't see any of that from inside the prison. He had no idea how big his story really was. And I wonder if you're in a similar place right now. I wonder if you're in the middle of something difficult, something painful, something that feels like a dead end, and you have no idea how big this chapter really is. God is pressing your marriage forward, not just for your sake. He's pressing it forward because there is something on the other side of this season that affects more people than you can count. There are lessons being forged in your struggle that someone else will desperately need to hear someday. There are patterns being broken in your household that will set your children and grandchildren free from cycles they won't even know they were destined to repeat. There is a testimony forming in your faithfulness that will become a lifeline for someone else's faith. This is the bigger reason. This is what you can't see from where you're standing. And I know it's hard to think about others when you're the one in the middle of the pain. I know it can feel almost dismissive to say your struggle is serving a larger purpose when you just want the struggle to end. But I'm not saying that to minimize what you're going through. I'm saying it to dignify it. Because what you're enduring right now is not meaningless. What you're building right now, slowly, painfully, one faithful choice at a time, is not going to waste. God does not waste anything. Not the arguments you've learned to walk away from. Not the nights you've spent in prayer. Not the tears you've cried when no one was watching. He gathers all of it. He weaves all of it. And He uses all of it in ways you won't fully understand until you're on the other side, looking back. I've been doing this long enough to know that the marriages God is pressing forward are rarely the ones that look perfect on the outside. They're the ones that have been through fire. They're the ones that have been stretched and tested and reshaped. They're the ones where both people have had to confront their own brokenness before they could learn how to love each other well. That's not a sign of failure. That's a sign of refining. The book of Malachi speaks of God as a refiner and purifier. It says He sits like a silversmith, watching over the precious metal as it's heated, knowing exactly when to pull it from the fire. And the silversmith doesn't remove the metal too early. He waits until his own reflection can be seen clearly in the surface. That's what God is doing in your marriage. He's waiting until His reflection, His character, His love, His patience, His faithfulness can be seen clearly in the way you and your spouse relate to one another. And He won't rush that process just because it's uncomfortable. He won't shortcut it just because you're tired. He knows that what He's producing in you is worth the time it takes to get it right. So, if things are moving slowly, don't assume that means nothing is happening. Sometimes the slowest seasons are the ones where the deepest work is being done. And sometimes, God moves something forward by first making you wait. If you've been watching this and feeling like something is stirring in your spirit, like this message is speaking to exactly where you are, I want to invite you to consider subscribing to this channel, Angelic Light's channel, as a way of staying connected to messages like this one. Not because I'm promising anything magical will happen, but because building a habit of hearing truth, of being reminded of what God is doing, even when you can't see it, that matters. It shapes the way you think. It guards your heart against discouragement. And in seasons where you feel alone in your struggle, it helps to be reminded that you are part of something much larger than yourself. Let me say something about patience, because I don't want this to sound like a sermon about waiting without purpose. Patience is not passive. Patience is not sitting around hoping things change. Biblical patience, the kind of endurance the Apostle Paul talks about, is active. It's a decision you make every single day to remain steady while God is still at work. It's a refusal to give up just because you haven't seen results yet. It's the courage to believe that the story isn't over just because this chapter is hard. When Paul wrote to the Romans, he said that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. That's a progression. That's a journey. And you don't get to skip steps. You don't get to jump straight from suffering to hope without walking through the endurance and the character building in between. But here's what I want you to hold on to. Hope is the destination. Not just surviving, but genuine, unshakable hope. That's what's waiting for you on the other side of this season. And God is pressing your marriage forward precisely because He's leading you toward that hope. Some of you watching this have been through more than anyone else knows. Your marriage has faced things you haven't told anyone about. There are wounds beneath the surface that you've never spoken out loud. There are moments of doubt, seasons of distance, battles fought in silence that no one else saw. And maybe you've wondered if any of it mattered. Maybe you've wondered if staying faithful has been worth it. Let me tell you something as clearly as I know how. It matters. It is worth it. And the fact that you're still here, still listening, still seeking something to hold on to, that's not weakness. That's the faith of someone who refuses to give up on what God started. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells a parable about a widow who kept coming to an unjust judge, asking for justice. The judge didn't care about her. He didn't fear God or respect people. But eventually, because she was persistent, because she kept coming back, He gave her what she was asking for. And Jesus uses that story to say, if even an unjust judge responds to persistence, how much more will your heavenly Father, who loves you, who sees you, who knows what you need before you even ask? Your persistence in prayer matters. Your refusal to give up on your marriage matters. Your quiet faithfulness in moments no one else sees, it matters to God. And He is responding, not always in ways you expect, not always on your timeline, but He is moving and He is pressing things forward. Because the reason is bigger than you think. It always has been. I want to speak something over you before I close, not as a promise of a specific outcome, but as a blessing rooted in what I believe God does for those who trust Him. May you find rest in knowing that you are not carrying your marriage alone. May you experience moments of unexpected grace, moments where love feels lighter than it has in a long time. May your eyes be opened to the work God is doing beneath the surface, even when the surface still feels difficult. May your heart be protected from despair, from bitterness, from the temptation to give up right before the breakthrough. And may you carry with you, from this moment forward, the unshakable truth that God's purposes for your life are good, even when the path is hard. You are not forgotten. Your marriage is not forgotten, and the story you are living is still being written by hands far more capable than your own. If this message meant something to you today, take a moment to leave a comment below, not for my sake, but for the sake of someone else who might scroll through and see your words and realize they're not alone. There's power in community, even the kind of community that exists in a comment section. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, if you feel led. And above all, keep going. One more day, one more prayer, one more moment of faithfulness. That's all God is asking, and He will handle the rest. Thank you for being here. I'll talk to you soon.